Now that more than half of the world population and much more than half of the United States population lives in cities, it's clear that the food system must be comparable with urbanization to be successful. Jan Mandyck, Chief Sustainability Officer at United Technologies, is using a system approach to seamlessly connect farm and fork, even in the most urban areas, so that we can waste less. Please welcome Jan as he shares his thoughts on sustainable urbanization, the future of food.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be with all of you today, and I'm very mindful I'm standing between you and the wine and cheese. But I hope to tell you a compelling story about food waste today and the scale and consequence of which we may not have imagined before now. I really want to thank Cornell for pulling us together for this great event and this great conference so we can have these conversations. We have a unique perspective on food at United Technologies, and it may not be readily apparent. So we may be known for our Pratt & Whitney jet engines, for our Otis elevators, for our Carrier air conditioners, and you may be saying, why is this guy standing in front of me talking about food? What you may not know is that we keep more food fresh before it reaches your refrigerator than almost anybody else on the planet. We do it with marine container refrigeration systems that move food on our oceans. We do it with truck trailer refrigeration systems that move food from our farms to our grocery stores. And we do it with supermarket refrigeration systems that keep food fresh at retail. So we have a long history and a unique vantage point into the world's food supply. And that vantage point has brought us to a point where we are very concerned. We're concerned about the future of our food and how we're going to feed a growing planet. I'm going to start with the big picture perspective, and this is one of my favorite images. It's the Earth at night. It tells us so much. It certainly tells us that light is a very good indicator of development, and we're sitting in a pretty bright spot on the map today. What's interesting to me about this image, though, is we know people are home elsewhere and the lights aren't on yet. And we have to consider the energy implications, the environmental implications, the food implications when those lights come on. Now, what's driving this are two trends of our time that are almost like the ocean's tide. You can't stop them. First is population growth and urbanization. So today we live on a planet of 7 billion people, with just a little bit more than half of us live in cities. And in just 35 years, we're going to live on a planet of 9.6 billion people. We're going to grow our population 35% in 35 years. And when we do that, 2/3 of all the world's population is going to live in a city or urban setting. This is fundamentally going to change cities around the world. This is fundamentally going to change how we think about food, because people are moving farther and farther and farther away from their food sources as we're growing the population very rapidly. So these are the issues we think about. And what we find, whether it's talking about buildings or aviation or food, we simply need better data to make better decisions. We know data drives decisions. We are very committed to advancing the global dialogue, bringing new data to the market to help us think about these issues a little bit differently. That led us to publish and release a new book just a couple months ago called Food Foolish, which examines the hidden connections between food waste, hunger, and climate change. So what I'm going to share with you today is kind of the high-level big data from the book. We're happy to make the book available to anybody who would like one. It's on Amazon.com. If you happen to buy one, all the proceeds go to food charities. So any conversation with food has to start with a conversation about farming. Farming is the largest human endeavor on Earth. We literally move more land and alter the face of the Earth's landscape with farming than we do anything else. Farming uses 38% of our ice-free land. If we take all the cities in the world and we put them together, do you know how much land they use? 2%. Cities use 2%, farming uses 38%. And the ugly truth is, after all that land, and after all the energy and the environmental issues that we put into our farming that we're going to explore. The ugly, ugly truth is we throw away 40% of our food. 40% of our food never makes it from our farm to our fork. It's hard to imagine a more inefficient system for the one resource we need to sustain the human race. Where else in society do we tolerate 40% inefficiency for anything? Yet we've accepted that for years with our food system. And I think it's about to change. So we're going to explore the reasons why we waste our food, the consequences, and the types of food we waste. But the fact is, we waste 1.3 billion metric tons of food every year. That's the mountain of food waste. Now, if you think an elephant weighs 1 metric ton, think about 1.3 billion happy, healthy elephants standing on top of each other. That's the mountain of food waste we create every year. It might be helpful to look at what are the food waste types, what are the categories. So this is UN data, which breaks down the types of food that we waste. Now, the number one category is cereals, excluding beer, by the way, according to the UN, because apparently we waste no beer. But cereals is the number one category of food waste. But I invite you to look at the next 5 categories. Vegetables, fruits, excluding wine, and I know we're not going to waste any wine when I'm done talking, milk and eggs, meat, and seafood. These 5 categories represent greater than 50% of all the food that's lost or wasted on the planet. And these 5 categories have one thing in common. We can extend the life of that food, the useful life of that food, through simple refrigeration techniques. We need to do that because we live on a hungry planet. 1 in 9 people will go to bed hungry tonight. That's 805 million people. That's the equivalent population of the entire United States and the entire European Union that don't get enough food. Think about the big picture here. We produce and grow enough food to feed 10 billion people. We live on a planet of 7 billion people. Only about 6 are getting enough food. That's the tremendous inefficiency in the system. That's the penalty we're paying with food waste. So here's hunger by the numbers. On the far left is the 805 million people that I talked about who are going to go to bed hungry. On the far right is an equal tragedy. We have over 100 million children under the age of 5 on the planet who are underweight. And in the middle is a category called hidden hunger. We explore this in the book, and we're starting to see a lot more literature on the subject of hidden hunger. Hidden hunger afflicts 2 billion people of the 7 billion that we have on the planet. So what's hidden hunger? Hidden hunger is people are getting enough food, but they're not getting the right food. They're not getting the vitamins, the minerals, the micronutrients that they can be the most productive that they can be. 2 billion people. We found through the literature in our book and our research that you can actually put a number on this. So estimates are that hidden hunger can cost an economy 1% of GDP. So what would 1% of GDP look like in India? Excuse me, why India? Well, in India, greater than 50% of the fruits and vegetables are lost every year. 1% of India's GDP is $20 billion. So we said, what else in the Indian economy looks like $20 billion for comparison? And in a world of ironies, India's entire food welfare plan is $20 billion. Now, the United Nations has done a full cost accounting of food waste. And for the first time put an estimate on what it might be costing our world, our society, on an annual basis. Their roll-up is that it's cost $2.6 trillion a year. Now, they measure this at the economic level, the social level, and the environmental level. So let's look at all 3. So at the economic level, $2.6 trillion is the value. At the economic level, $1 trillion is the value of the food. Right, we're throwing away 40% of our food. It has a retail value if it can get to market. It's about $1 trillion. And by the way, baked into there is $100 billion in subsidies we give to farmers to grow food that we then throw away. $119 billion in there. So what's the Social costs. Well, the UN pegs it almost at $900 billion, the social costs of food waste. So this is the health implications, the livelihood loss, and the risk of conflict, which is the number one area in this category at almost $400 billion. This risk of conflict represents the fact, according to the UN, that we're overcompensating in the system. So we're actually using more land than we need to. We're using more water than we need to grow our food. It's creating border conflicts. It's creating strife around the world where land and water is scarce. The UN pegs that at $400 billion. And then there's the environmental cost of food waste, which the UN pegs at nearly $700 billion. This is the cost associated with biodiversity, land and soil, water scarcity. Number one is the greenhouse gas emissions, $305 billion. That's just pegged to the price of carbon. We'll come back to greenhouse gas emissions. So where do we waste our food? Well, 1/3 happens at the consumer level. That's where we buy too much and we throw it away. Or we're served too much in a restaurant and we don't finish the meal and it gets thrown away. But 2/3 happens at the production and distribution level, which is really an emerging economy issue, where food rots in fields before harvest. It rots in poor transportation networks. It rots in open-air markets before consumers can access the food. It has a big carbon footprint. So if you think about all the energy, all the carbon we put in to make the food that we then throw away, that 40%, the carbon footprint of that 40% is 3.3 billion metric tons of CO2. Again, UN data. So this is fuel for tractors, electricity for water pumps, power for food packaging stations, the whole food chain. That 40% that we then throw away, carbon footprint is 3.3 billion metric tons. If you measure it in a different way, if you measured food waste as a country, it would be the world's 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases. But when was the last time you heard the words food waste in any climate policy discussion? We're trying to change that. We argue that the low-hanging fruit for climate protection is literally rotting in front of us, and it's food waste. This carbon footprint is jeopardizing future sources of food. So if you think about the ocean, if you close your eyes for a minute, you imagine the Earth from space, that iconic image, that marble image, what do you see? You see blue, because the oceans cover 71% of our planet. But we get just 2% of our food from the ocean. So the ocean will be an important source for us as we think about feeding 9.6 billion people. But here's the perverse carbon cycle at work, and Mike had mentioned this before. Over the last 200 years, the levels of acidity in our oceans have risen almost 30%. This is ocean acidification. This is where the plankton and the small shrimp are dying because of the level of acids, which is killing off a food source for the small fish, which is killing off a food source for the bigger fish that we want to eat. So we have to lower our carbon emissions from those associated with food waste and every other source to keep our oceans healthy as a future supply of food. And while we're talking about water, let's think about fresh water. So of all the water on the planet, just 1.3% is fresh water that we can drink. And of that, we use 70% to grow our food. And we know this, right? If you've ever tried to grow a tomato in a garden or in a pot, you got to put a lot of water into the dirt to get that plant to produce fruit. On a global basis, it's 70%. Now let's think about food waste. And this was one of the more shocking findings in our research for the book. The water we use to grow the food that we throw away is greater than the water used by any single nation on the planet. Let me just say it again. The water we use to grow and make the food that we throw away is more than the water used by any country on the map. We can measure it at the global level. We can measure it at the national level. We can measure it at the individual level. Now, I've done this, and I'm sure maybe some of you have too. You buy a head of broccoli, You put it in your refrigerator and you forget about it. You find it a week later, 2 weeks later, it's turned yellow, it's turned brown, you have to throw it away. Now, we've just learned about the carbon implications of that. But when you throw away a head of broccoli, you also flush away 5.4 gallons of fresh water that it takes to grow a single head of broccoli. So what needs to change? Well, we need an everything and above strategy to solve the issues of food waste, to extend food supplies so we can feed more people and lower the environmental and water consequences. We need to change consumer behavior to address that 1/3 of the pie, and there's some great places where that's being done. The UK is probably a leader in the field in consumer campaigns. We have to think about what types of fruits and vegetables do we eat, and should we consider the ugly fruits and vegetables that have just as much nutrition? Those are all consumer issues. At the production, at that 2/3 level, we have to think about grains, which is the #1 category. Today, when grains are harvested in many emerging economies, they're simply left on tarps, and we lose it to weather and to pests as opposed to simple grain silos. The other thing we have to think about is refrigeration. Now, how do we preserve our food? Since the dawn of time, we've been trying to figure this out. We've been salting it, drying it, pickling it, putting it in root cellars. And all of those are effective strategies, but the #1 strategy that we found on how we can extend food supplies is through simple refrigeration. Now, I can already hear what you guys are thinking. Okay, this is a corporate guy here. He's trying to sell his product, and is he really saving anything about the climate? So you want to put more refrigerated trucks on the road to save food waste, but they have a carbon footprint. Are you really doing anything? So we thought about the same thing, and so we hired Deloitte to answer this simple question. If the emerging economies had the same level of refrigeration as the developed world, on a net basis, could we save greenhouse gas emissions by avoiding food waste? Why Deloitte? We went to Deloitte because they did all the number crunching for the United Nations for their iconic report that came out about 2 years ago on the environmental footprint of food waste. They had all the data. They're the credible source. And the answer that came back is absolutely. So I'll give it to you in 2 ways. First of all, this is also intuitive, right? Because when we grow our food, if we leave it out, just fresh vegetables is one example. Fresh vegetables will last less than 2 days at 86 degrees Fahrenheit. This is when we grow our food. So back to the Deloitte study. The Deloitte study answered the question in 2 ways. First is the carbon emissions associated with increasing refrigeration in developing countries is 10 times less than the carbon emissions associated with saving the food that's going bad today, that's rotting in poor transportation networks, rotting in open-air markets. On the mass basis, by saving that food, we can reduce the global footprint, the greenhouse gas footprint of food waste on a carbon basis by more than 50%. So technology has to be one of the answers as we look at avoiding food waste. We did a quick study, case study in the book for India. India produces 28% of the world's bananas. It only exports 0.3% because of that 50% wastage that's happening in between. So we sponsored a study at the University of Nottingham in the UK that did a deep dive on India to say, okay, well, if India had just basic access to basic levels of refrigeration, what would happen to the banana supply? And what the Nottingham study found out is that India could grow its exports from today about 3,000 containers of bananas to 190,000 export cargo containers of bananas, which would support 95,000 local jobs. So food can be a resource and a source for national security from a trade standpoint. How are we going to do it? Well, we're chasing this. So the United Nations wants to create a $100 billion fund to mitigate climate change in developing countries by 2020. Now, they already have about $10 billion in the fund. So if the world achieves an outcome, a climate treaty, as a result of COP21 in December, in Paris this December, $100 billion is going to be used as an incentive to bring in the emerging economies to do something about climate. So if you're the Prime Minister of India, for example, or any emerging economy, but India's a big one, it's not unlikely to think that you're going to get $30 billion to do something about climate change. Now, what would you do with it today? Well, the eligible funding would be you'd reduce emissions from your power plants, you'd put lower emission vehicles on the road, you might build more energy efficient buildings, and all those things are needed and important. But why isn't avoiding food waste on the list? It's the only climate strategy that saves greenhouse gas emissions, saves water, feeds more people, and promotes national security. So we're working with our partners in NGOs to try to get out of the silos of discussions that are happening today, where people aren't connecting the dots here, the hidden connections that exist between food waste, climate, hunger, water emissions. That's why we wrote our book, to try to elevate the dialogue and to stimulate some broader and greater thinking on this issue and the future of our food supply. If you're interested in learning more or following subsequent research that we're funding, I invite you to follow us on our social media channels. I'll just conclude by saying, after doing the research and writing this book, I have hope. This is an issue we can solve. We can make big difference at the global level, at the national level, and the individual level. And I invite all of you to think about that, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Contributed to food waste. There's the good pictures, the restaurants, and then the individual families. Okay. Do you know which one is the biggest culprit? Where the different contributors around?
You know, the research on that isn't great. So 1/3 of the food that we waste on the planet is the sources you're talking about at the consumer level. From the data I see, I think the greatest source is at the household level. Because you think about it, grocery stores manage the food as best they can, right? Because if they lose it, that's literally money that they just flushed away. And restaurants do the same thing. It's the supply, so they have a different dynamic, and they're going to do everything that they can to manage it so it's not lost. Consumers are a different issue. You know, a lot of us shop with our eyes. I do a lot of the food shopping in my family, and after the research and doing this book, I've changed my approach. Before I would shop with my eyes, so you go down the aisle and you see food that's beautiful, and you put it in your basket, and you bring it home, and you know sometimes you don't use it. If we simply shop with a plan and not our eyes, it changes the outlook. So I shop with a plan now. If I don't have a plan for the food that I see, then I don't buy it. So a lot of it, my guess is after doing the research, of that 1/3, the majority of that is happening at the individual household level.
Of the 2/3 at the farm level or village, how much of that is really, you feel, driven by lack of proper storage conditions, and how much of it is due to field conditions and cultural practices, everything outside of the cold storage?
Yeah, well, so the number one category I showed was cereals, and the number one issue there is rudimentary storage, like grain silos, because it's just it's harvested and put on a tarp. So that's a big issue there. For the other categories, it breaks down into packaging. So in a lot of emerging economies, for example, delicate fruits are simply thrown in sacks and then put on a truck, and so you're going to lose a lot just from damage as opposed to other ways that it can be done. But a lot of it is lost, in long distribution chains where it simply rots in poor conditions. Particularly in emerging economies where it's warmer than it is in the rest of the world. Think about the farmer in India who's transporting tomatoes in the back of an open pickup truck 100 kilometers in 100-degree heat and getting to the market and realizing that he's lost 30, 40, 50% of the load along the way. So those are the issues that we found in exploring the book.
So how much is, I would argue that, or I would guess that maybe these people are making good cost-benefit decisions, that they're looking at the cost of waste versus the cost of adding refrigeration, making rational decisions. So are you suggesting that our cost of refrigerated storage is too high, or is it ignorance, or what is the solution? Are we having irrational decision makers? Or why do you see this?
I think the solution in emerging economies is lack of access to capital. So, farmers want to keep they don't want to lose 50% of their vegetables or fruits on the way to market, but they don't have a better way. And so that's why I think if we think about the issue of food and food waste in the context of mitigating climate change, it will unlock sources of funding and new policies to do something about it. Yeah, I met a guy who's trying to develop an Uber app for refrigerated trucks in India. You have to think differently about technology. So I'm a smallhold farmer. I want to get my tomatoes to market. It's 100 kilometers away. I'm not big enough yet to have my own fleet, or let alone a refrigerated fleet. But is there a cost-effective way that I can get some on-demand source so that I can get my 100% of my tomatoes to market and not just 50% of my tomatoes to market? So I think it's capital, and that's why we're exploring this as a climate issue.
Food waste for vegetables is one of the highest in the U.S. Is that true?
Those are global numbers in the global data.
But anyway, it's pretty high. I'm wondering about consumers really prefer, say, for fresh vegetables as opposed to canned or frozen vegetables. I'm wondering if you look at the relative amount of waste of, say, fresh vegetables in California versus, say, frozen green beans.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not a nutritional expert or why people make those trade-offs. But there's definitely a bias towards fresh vegetables and fresh produce, and you can just see it. When you walk into any grocery store, that's the first thing that you walk into by design, is that particular area. Anybody else?
One of the charts said that government spending at $100 billion for food wasted. Is that something that can be corrected? What's happening?
Yeah, so the UN estimates that there's $120 billion in local food subsidies. This is subsidies that governments give to farmers to grow food that we then throw away. So, it doesn't make sense to cut that off. It's not the farmer's fault, necessarily. He's growing food that we need. So the question is, how can we turn that subsidy into something that maybe not only encourages the farmer to grow the food, but also provides some way for the farmer to get the food to market so it's not lost, whether it's these grain silos or some other application that will allow us to save food. The point here is, as I mentioned, we grow enough food to feed everybody, but almost 1 billion of us are starving every night. So it's an issue of how can we extend food supplies and get food to where it needs to be so more people get more food so they're not going to bed hungry.
So let's say you were able to decrease the waste by half, and now you get that to market. Don't you disrupt the economics of all that food? And that's an unintended consequence.
Well, hopefully you're getting it to market where people aren't getting food. So I wouldn't think about it that we're now getting 40% or more food in the Wegmans market, which I would agree could disrupt the system here. But let's talk about getting 40% more food to people in Africa and people in India and people in China and people in Cambodia that don't have access to the food. I think that's how we need to think about the distribution of the food issue.
Now you're talking about, you had all your silos, all the silos, but you don't have the network of logistics to get that food to those people. To your point, there's no capital, those people don't have money to pay for it, but, unless you're just getting it to them because you're getting it out of waste. And that involves cost, which involves all the things you're talking about, petroleum, all of those things. And now, you're creating all this extra food, putting it in the market, you're still going to drive down that, the cost of, from an economic standpoint, you're going to drive down the cost of food. The cost of food as 20%.
Maybe. But the issue is there are people who aren't getting food. So getting food to those people, it has to be a critical priority for us. That's where 40% of it can go. How do you do it? You're right. You need transportation networks. You need to build a whole sort of network to do that. And capital is scarce. If we're going to create a $100 billion fund to do something about climate change, why don't we do something about this at the same time? And save climate emissions along the way, and improve our global food supply, and save more water. The UN says that for us to feed a planet of 9.6 billion people, we have to increase our agriculture production 70 to 100%. Tell me where we're going to get the water. Tell me where we're going to get the land. We're running out of land. We're running out of arable land to do this. And do we really have the environmental license to do it? Because if we don't change today's paradigm, here's how we're going to feed 9.6 billion people. We're going to grow more food, to throw more away, to try to feed more. And maintain this incredible 40% inefficiency in the system. There's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way, and along the way, we're going to save a lot of climate emissions, 3.3 billion metric tons. We're going to save a lot of water, and we're going to feed more people. It would if you had the water and the land to do it. So we're using 38% of our ice-free land to farm. The best farming land is gone. We've been farming for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, climate change may change that, right? May change the maps, as Mike showed. So new areas may emerge and old areas may go away, so there could be disruption. But today, we grow the food where we have the water and we have the land. We could distribute it probably. Is it 100% efficient that way? Probably not. But the areas where we need to push it don't have the land, don't have the water.
Your favorite idea? You've done all the work and stuff. What would you do?
We need to do a million things. Let's start at the consumer level. What could we do ourselves? So I mentioned the UK. We researched who's got the best kind of consumer campaign. The UK does. They have a program called Love Food, Hate Waste, where they're engaging with the consumers at the retail level, at the supermarket level. They're making a huge difference. There's a move in the UK to also love your ugly fruits. We have a romantic notion here about what our fruits and vegetables look like. We want our apples to be like that apple right there. We want them to be perfectly round and beautiful and symmetrical and the same shape so they stack beautifully in a display. But guess what? They come from nature, and Mother Nature doesn't produce 100% of them that way. So what happens to the other ones? Well, some of them go to applesauce, but in other commodities, they're thrown away. So we have to think about what we do from that perspective. And then we need to solve this two-thirds issue at the production and distribution level. And that's the access to capital we've been talking about building the grain silos for the grain and looking for ways that we can extend the supplies of the the food supplies that have the most vitamins and nutrients that we have, which are the fruits and vegetables.
Have you ever looked at whether or not, what sort of relationship there is between food quality and food waste? So in countries that have higher food costs, there's going to be less waste?
Not necessarily. So food is relatively inexpensive. Right. Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, one way is if you have higher food costs, it's treated as a more valuable resource. And so, yes, hopefully people are treating it that way and wasting less of it at the individual and the consumer level. So that's one issue. It's hard to imagine that you want to drive up prices to try to do something about it. So, I don't think from a policy perspective, I don't think that's someplace people would go.
I was just thinking when, I'm always shocked when I come to the U.S. how cheap food is compared to the North border. And, it's just so easy to forget about broccoli because it's not that expensive to go get an fresh broccoli. If you're paying 3 times as much, then you think twice about whether or not to throw it away.
Absolutely.
Do you think we don't grow a lot of organic food down the house?
The question was if we grow a lot of organic food, will it help? I think we need to grow all types of food. And
consumers are so into it, like everything is organic, non-GMO, blah, blah, blah. And these two companies will treat their consumers, so it's not going to have any good.
yeah, I think the way you look at the organic food movement is it's done very, very well, and there's obviously consumer pull for it, and retailers who want to respond to that consumer pull are adjusting. But that's really, I think the organic movement is a U.S. and European-based movement. I think where you don't have food, I don't think you care whether it's organic or not. I'll be around during wine and cheese. Happy to answer any more questions you may have. Thank you.